Hello and welcome to Feedstuffs 365 and National Hog Farmer. I'm Ann Hess. The foundation of the pork industry's market demand work is a comprehensive understanding of the marketplace and the pork consumer. Credible data. The National Pork Board uses checkoff funds to invest in tools to determine what consumers are hearing, seeing, searching, eating, buying, saying, feeling, and thinking to develop actionable insights to build trust and add value to the U.S. pork industry. Joining us to discuss those insights today are four members of the National Pork Board team: Sarah Showalter, Consumer and Business Insights Manager; Dr. David Newman, Senior Vice President of Market Growth; Jose De Jesus, Senior Director of Multicultural Marketing; and Kevin Sheehan, Senior Director, Processor Engagement. Welcome all, and thank you for joining us today.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Before we jump into today's discussion, I'd like to remind the audience tuning in, you can post your questions at any time in the chat, or if you are tuning in via social media, please post those in the comments. So Sarah, let's start with you. Checkoff funds are used to subscribe to specific databases to identify and analyze sales, consumer trends, and sentiment. Can you describe what some of those tools are and why we use them?
Yeah, thank you, Ann. We're spending $2.7 million a year to partner with an ecosystem of research partners that will really help improve our insight and knowledge of the pork consumer. This supports the research pillar of the National Pork Board. By partnering with that ecosystem of partners, it really helps us understand not only what consumers are eating and buying, but what are they hearing in the market? What are they seeing and searching for online? And ultimately, what are they thinking and feeling about the product? Understanding those things helps us get to what matters most and really develop those actionable insights to build trust and add value. For instance, we can understand what consumers have done in the past through things like retail point of sale data. What are they buying and where? We also have access to household shopper data, which helps us understand demographics, multicultural consumers, geographies, also where they're buying, but then what else might be in the basket when they're buying pork. And finally, we have visibility into food service. We know what is being menued, what formats, what flavors are trending, and how do we understand those as opportunities for the industry. Not only do we know what's happened in the past, but we also try to have visibility to anticipate what is going to happen in the future. We keep a pulse on macro trends that may influence behavior, but then also use custom research tools like quantitative surveys, as well as qualitative tools to not only understand what consumers say they might do in the future, but also really get into the why. By using these tools, NPB uses checkoff funds to really do this data-driven research so that producers can do what they do best: raise and provide a safe, wholesome product for consumers to buy.
So Sarah, I mean, with this wealth of knowledge, how can these tools help the industry understand consumers' perception of pork?
Yeah, so the foundation of our market development work is really built on this comprehensive understanding of not only the marketplace, but the pork consumer. So part of the investment that we make to drive demand is in this in-depth research to understand not only why consumers are buying pork, but maybe why they're not. And so by having this very granular view of the consumer, we analyze the data and turn that into insights that ultimately we go out and amplify across the value chain. So by working closely with retailers, food service partners, packers, and others, we can share what we've learned and then enable them to make data-driven decisions on positioning and promoting pork.
David, I want to turn to you now. I mean, with that data and those insights available, what actions has the industry taken to learn who the modern consumer is and who we need to target in the coming years?
Right. Thank you. Well, what's important is the insights that Sarah was mentioning just a minute ago. It's really a very targeted approach that we're taking at the National Pork Board, where we're gathering insights, and we are taking, instead of taking a broader shotgun approach to trying to understand who the consumer is, we're taking a more targeted approach and understanding even the generational difference of who our future consumer is for pork. And a great example of that is the generation that has carried pork consumption very heavily for the last 20 or 30 years, and that is the baby boomer generation. And as we start to think about who the future consumer of pork is, this is about transitioning our marketing efforts and our promotional efforts towards that long-term next on consumer of the future. And if we don't do that, fresh pork really runs the risk of becoming obsolete among that generation. And I'll give you some examples. Our data, the data and insights that Sarah was just referencing a minute ago, show that over the next 10 years, if the industry doesn't start to bring those consumers along, we run the risk of losing approximately 2.5 pounds of consumption per year per person. And that is a staggering volume when you think about the production we have in our country. So the question is who is that consumer as we talk about what happens next? And our data and insights lead us to understand that we very specifically need to focus on millennials and on Gen Zs. So these are younger families. They are the consumer of the future. Even when we think about things that are important to those different consumers, we need to think about that. And an example of that is human nutrition, which is a barrier to consumption amongst that population. We have very focused efforts right now focusing on millennial moms as an example. So being able to get down and get specific on who we're trying to reach is really important. Multicultural consumers is another area that's very important. They're the bulk of the growth in the United States over the past 20 years. They're going to be a critically important part of the growth over the next 20 years. Jose is going to cover some of that here in just a minute. But the point is, we cannot ignore that future consumer because they have a lot of choices when it comes to protein. And our job and our role of what we're doing at National Pork Board is putting pork in the best possible position that we can.
So you mentioned that Gen Z and that millennial target audience there, as well as the multicultural. David, are there other barriers besides health and nutrition as far as reaching these consumers?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ann. So what I would say is not just to think about barriers, but let's talk about what brings people into the category. And the most important thing to think about with consumer is, of course, price and affordability are very important on anything that we talk about. But the number one piece that we talk about, attribute for pork coming into the market, is taste and flavor. Taste and flavor is critically important. Think about what drives a consumer to bacon as an example. Now, this is about all pork, not just bacon or other processed porks, but taste and flavor is critically important. Nutrition is a barrier to consumption, especially when you think about some of the audiences I mentioned earlier, millennials and Gen Zs. They are worried about what they're feeding their family. They're worried about what they're feeding themselves. So we need to make sure that we're positioning pork in the right way. Another interesting thing that we look at is all the way to the cut level is how are they purchasing product? What type of, do they like ready to eat? How do they prepare pork? That's another very important piece. Today, in this fast-paced world that we live in, consumers are using new technology. They're using items such as sous vide. They're using an air fryer for a bulk of what they're cooking. So we need to be able to position pork items in front of the consumer in a manner that they want them. And so that is part of the focus of what the market growth team does every day at the National Pork Board, and all the individuals you see here on the screen today.
So Jose, David touched on the multicultural strategy that's obviously based on this data as well. Can you give us an example of one sector of consumers you reach?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having us here, Ann. Everything we do is with data in mind. We don't necessarily go to market at all without the data that our team puts together. I think that's the best way to put it, because you're more effective that way, knowing how you're moving forward and how to really effectively reach this consumer. So One of the segments, two of the segments actually are African American consumers and Latino consumers. And I'll focus on the Latino community first. The Latino community eats a lot of pork, but we know based on the data that we have that there's a lot of challenges. Pork is culturally relevant. We know that it resonates with them. It's part of the culture, if you will. We grow up eating pork at every stage of our lives, but we know that there are some concerns, some barrier concerns to consumption. So primarily around nutrition. So when you think about our strategy that we've developed, it really is tapping into that affinity for pork, which is all based on taste and flavor. But then how do we address some of those misconceptions that they have around nutrition? Because we do know pork is nutritious and, it should be part of everybody's diet. Unfortunately, in our culture, there's a lot of misconception about pork. And so our challenge is how do we continue to instill confidence in consumers that what they're eating is good for them and their family? And so, our strategy, our strategic platform called Pone Pork, which means add pork, is this whole idea that we recognize based on the data that we have that consumers are gravitating towards plant-forward meals. And so this idea that they're eating more with vegetables and veggies and greens. So how can pork be part of that occasion? We understand that in the past, maybe we would have kind of pushed back on that and kind of just positioned pork as a center of the plate. But, we understand that consumers are eating pork more as an ingredient. We understand that they're eating more, as I mentioned, plant forward meal. So instead of fighting it, we're just trying to meet the consumer where the consumer is, which is how can pork be part of that occasion? And I think similarly to that, the African American consumer almost in the same boat in terms of, gravitating a little bit towards that plant forward meal, although they have different challenges, lots of processed consumption, which is great. We care about the whole portfolio, fresh and processed. But then how can we influence that fresh consumption a little bit more? So again, similar approach in terms of, positioning pork as a go-to protein and ultimately make sure that the consumer have permission to eat pork guilt-free.
So you've collected all this data, you're going to put it into a plan. Obviously, we don't want to put that plan up on a shelf to collect dust. Jose, how does the industry connect this data to action with those supply chain partners?
Yeah, we do not want that data to be put away. So, we use it in multiple ways. I mean, number one, we execute against that data. I mean, our producers, have put a lot of money into, investing into the research capability and insights. So, we use it to drive our planning, to create our strategy and execute our strategy. We are the national pork board, right? So we got to know all things pork. But beyond that, I think one of the best things that I think we do is we really take it to the supply chain, specifically retailers and packer processors. Why? Because they're closer to the consumer. And so we have a lot of engagement with retailer, for example, where we partner with them. A lot of them always are looking for whether it's content or any sort of insight that we might have that can help them increase their sales, which ultimately benefits our producers. So we partner with them in lots of different ways. We identify the top 10 key market for both African American consumers and Hispanic consumers, retailers within those markets, and then we go to market there. We do things such as social content or point of sale material where we partner with a retailer and try to drive sales for fresh pork, for example, in a specific market. So yeah, everything we do is data driven. And so we identify the key markets where there's a lot of consumption going on, that idea of fishing where the fish are, but then also partnering with those retailers that are selling lots of pork and moving lots of volume.
So we've talked about partnering with retailers. Kevin, I want to turn to you. I mean, describe your role and how you're supporting the packers and processors with that data provided from your team.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Ann. So here at the Pork Board, my role is around packers and processors. It's what I do is I work to provide strategic direction back to our staff on how to engage with the packers and processors. I have a good time developing and maintaining business relationships with all segments of the pork packing industry, that whole community, to make sure that our marketing efforts and our issues and our education and research initiatives are aligned with the packers' priorities. I'll work at the executive level and talk to the executive teams at the packers, but also with the leads of sales and marketing and consumer data, livestock, sustainability, et cetera, maintaining those relationships. What this does is it allows the packer then to have a kind of a one-stop shop when it comes to contacting the National Pork Board. You know, instead of trying to figure out who to go to or who do I call, hey, let's just call Kevin. If I can answer their questions, I will. If not, I'll bring in the right folks from our teams, facilitate the meetings, and then, you know, work to best handle their needs.
So I imagine consumption and adding value to the product truly is a supply chain effort. How has the industry used that data to identify innovation opportunities with our packers and processors? And do you have an example of that?
Yeah, I do. You know, that's kind of the fun part of the business. That's kind of the toy store when it comes to innovation and whatnot. You know, at the Pork Checkoff, we center our work around research, education, and promotion. And, you know, the data that we collect, that's our research. And then the education that we provide a lot of times are test and learns that we've done at the retail level. And we'll take those test and learns and we'll give it to the packers and we'll give it to the processors and other retailers and convenience stores and stuff. And then they'll use these findings that we've got for their daily work. They'll use it in promotion of products at store level. They'll use it in their innovation teams, and then also use it for their, you know, for their long-term strategies. We've done some real fun work around ground pork and getting it into retail and food service channels. We've got a pork loin task force that's working right now on innovation with Culinary Institute of America. That's innovation around pork loin products. You know, through our data and insights, we provided guidance to the packers on, you know, hey, how do you reach more households? How do you get to these folks more often? And how do you get them eating pork on more eating occasions? You know, like Jose had said, our multicultural efforts are providing direction to the packers for reaching the African American and the Hispanic consumer. As far as examples, boy, first of all, you know, we've seen the packers and processors use our ground pork research. We did a big ground pork study in 2020, and before 2020, ground pork was in about 50% of the grocery stores. We only had about 50% distribution. Since then, grocery stores, there's ground pork everywhere, and that's a huge deal. Again, as we're trying to get folks to eat pork more often and on more eating occasions. The packers have taken our research, they've taken our data, and they've made changes to their product lines. They've made changes to their labeling because of the research that we did. One of the biggest findings that we had on ground pork was, you know, when you put ground pork in the meat case, you have to have the fat to lean ratio on the label. 80-20, 80% lean, 20% fat, 90% lean, 10% fat, like the other grinds. Don't make the consumer turn that package over and have to do math to figure out what's the lean content. So all of the packers have changed to that, and they made changes on their labeling. We see new items hit the market. There's meatballs out there. There's patties that were not out there before. And there's packers that had never made ground pork before. And we took them our research and said, hey, this is something you need to look at. And after they spent some time on it, they're like, wow, we have got to get into that market because we're missing those sales and we're missing those consumers. So they used our research. They developed products, ground pork products, and now they're out nationwide distributing that. And packers and processors that already had ground pork, well, they expanded their portfolio. Different flavors, different sizes, different lean contents. There's a brand new soy ginger ground pork out there that's kind of fun. They're ready for like an egg roll in the bowl type of a recipe or different Asian inspired dishes. You know, and we've seen innovation on different cuts and different flavorings. There is a Nashville hot marinated tender that's out there right now, and there's a couple packers that have developed what's called a pork griller steak, and it is taking a pork loin, and instead of cutting it vertically like you would a pork chop, they're cutting it horizontally, marinating it, and then it's ready for your air fryer, or it's ready to put out on the grill. It is a steak-sized piece of pork, which is really cool. And the pre-marinated items, those are kind of in response to, and the different cuts are a response to the data and insights that we provided about trying to reach the younger consumers, the Gen Zs and the millennials, and the different cooking appliances that they have. We can't just offer a big pork loin and then have somebody say, well, gosh, that just does not fit in my air fryer. So thus come the smaller pieces. We got a packer out there that is making boneless ribs. You've heard of boneless chicken wings. Well, why not boneless ribs? And so it's a pork loin that's then cut into baby back rib sized pieces and marinated, put in a vacuum sealed bag, and take it home. You can put it in your air fryer, put it out on your grill, and you have got, boneless barbecue ribs, which is kind of fun. Different innovation around pork belly. We had a packer come to us and say, hey, help us out with understanding what the pork belly market is. And, less than a year later, they're out with 3 different flavors of pork belly so that you can cook it on the grill and have pork belly burnt ends, or cook it in an air fryer and have Vietnamese banh mi sandwich. Different data and insights that we have. We did a pretty large packaging study that we wanted to take a look at how are consumers perceiving pork and in what different packages, do they prefer. And this led packers to make decisions on their new product development of how do I pack this product? Do I put it in a brick pack, which is a vacuum sealed package that actually looks like a brick of ground pork, or do I put it in a chub? And a chub is, if you've ever bought breakfast sausage in a roll with the 2 little metal clips on the ends, that's a chub. Do I put my product in a chub or the more traditional overwrap? And so, I'm proud to tell you that the packers and processors, they're using our research, they're using our data. It's being used to get customers more choices around pork products, and feeding their family.
Great insight there into the packers and processors. David, I want to turn to you. How are we using that data to drive long-term strategies for millennial and Gen Z consumers? Can you tell us more about the importance and the level of detail in this work?
Sure. Well, everything you've heard from the rest of the team is a critical component of our long-term strategy. And so, hopefully what everyone took away here is we really need to focus on who that consumer is, not only today, but moving forward into the future. And so when you think about the budget and the work that we're doing at the National Pork Board on behalf of 60,000 pig farmers in America, we take that very seriously. And especially whenever you think about the last 18 months in this industry. It's been a challenging time. This is a critical time for us to still focus on demand, both domestically and internationally. And so as our board of directors allocates funding in 2024, just over half of our budget is actually allocated towards demand efforts. And so that is what this team is overseeing every day. Now, you don't see progress overnight. This is a very strong component of both a short-term activation and a long-term activation. And I'll explain what I mean. In the short term, we need to keep our eye on the prize for volume. We still need to be able to find a home for all of that product and work on innovation projects. Many of the things that Kevin just talked about a minute ago, or looking at multicultural, as Jose talked about, and using the data that Sarah mentioned to really formulate a plan. So we have a short-term strategy in place right now in 2024. This consumer piece is about a long-term plan. This is about how do we focus on what's going to be happening a decade from now, before we find ourselves in another challenging economic time in this business. Let's try to create enough consumer pull-through of our product that we can try to prevent that from happening again. So working with our partners, whether that is our producers, our states who are critically important to the work that we do, working with retailers, working with packer processors, everyone throughout the entire value chain is what our entire market growth team is focused on. We're proud of the work that we're doing on behalf of producers every day. And I will tell you that we are committed to both the long and short-term plans that we have here on behalf of producers in order to try to move more pork.
So as we wrap up our discussion here, any final comments or key takeaways you'd like to leave our audience today? Sarah, let's start with you.
Yeah, thank you, Anne. Just as David mentioned, like we're committed to understanding the consumer and really representing that voice as we think about how those insights can influence and drive both short-term and long-term demand. So we'll continue to really tap into that ecosystem of partners and continue to understand the ever-evolving consumer and bring those insights back to the industry to open opportunities across the value chain.
Jose?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll leave you with a couple thoughts. Number one, I would say, the whole team at the National Pork Board in market growth, the number one focus we have is to drive demand, period. I mean, if we're not doing that, then that's on us. But, that is our focus. That's what we're going to be doing moving forward, both as David mentioned in the short term and long term. We need to create value for our products and really for our producers to be profitable. And then number two, I would say in this whole environment of multicultural, which is the area that I lead, these are key consumers that are critical to the future of the industry. They're growing at a high rate, faster than any other demographic in this country. They eat a lot of pork. The affinity is unmatched. And while we have they do have some nutrition concerns with the product, we're actively and proactively dealing with that and addressing it. So, we're focused on creating demand, driving demand for our producers, and that's what we're going to be doing in the short and long term.
Kevin?
Yeah, get out to your grocery store, man. Look for the new innovative items and flavors that you're going to find out there. Get you some pork griller steaks, put them out on the grill. Look for the pork belly and all the new flavors of marinated tenders. Give them a try and enjoy them with your family.
Very good. David, any final comments from you?
I would just again reiterate that as everybody on the team said, we are committed to working on behalf of America's pork producers. And in the area of market growth, something for everyone to keep in mind is that the consumer dictates the survivability of our business. And so as we look at the focus we have today on really focusing on the long-term challenges that are ahead of us for consumer, I hope that gives producers the confidence that we are focused on the right areas here at the Pork Board, and just glad to be a part of this team, and thank you for your time.
David Newman, Sarah Showalter, Jose De Jesus, and Kevin Sheehan with the National Pork Board, thank you so much for joining us today. For more coverage and conversations on pork industry related topics, be sure to check out the live and on-demand section of Feedstuffs 365. For Feedstuffs and National Hog Farmer, I'm Ann Hess.